Thank you for inviting me. I guess I'm not everybody's parish priest, but I hope I can be your Roshi this morning. So nirvana, that's the goal, and you know that it means extinction. Well, it's the extinction of what? The poisons, of course, the different levels of consciousness. But we should look a little bit more at what that actually is like, looks like. So Bob Thurman, who's a famous professor of Tibetan studies at Columbia, which is right here, I'm next to Columbia here in New York City, in one of his latest books called Wisdom is Bliss, he goes through the Eightfold Path, and in his final chapter on samadhi, the eighth rung or prong, which is, by the way, the best description I've ever seen anyone's given of what it's actually like to experience these different levels of consciousness. He goes through the different levels that the Shurangama Sutra points out. The level on the traditional metaphysics, that there's the level of desire, the realms of desire, then there's the desireless realms of form, the immensities, and then finally getting into the trances, which are formless and ever more refined levels of consciousness. And it would seem like you're getting more and more abstract and refined. But Shurangama Sutra points out, and of course Bob does as well, that none of these is nirvana. So this is what he says in a couple of paragraphs here in the chapter. He says, while these are wonderful states to be in, they are not the pure bliss of nirvana, which is a kind of bliss that simultaneously and inconceivably, we are beyond mind here, simultaneously and inconceivably interfuses with all other life forms, even the most dense and alienated by misknowing. So he elaborates that on a couple of pages later. He said, a Buddha is definitely a master of all 8 states, all these different states, but not a terminal dweller in any one of them, as none of them is the ultimate reality of all things, from which a Buddha is by definition never apart. Rather, a Buddha is defined as someone who is present in all these states and in all other desire realm states simultaneously, active everywhere out of compassion for other beings still feeling caught in the trap of suffering. So it's not just bodhisattvas who postpone entry into bliss, to help, the universe, all sentient beings. That's what a Buddha is. The ultimate state is inclusive of all that. So then he has a little reflection. Why did the Buddha allow his individual vehicle students to imagine that nirvana was just such a state beyond the gross physical reality of the desire realm and beyond even the more subtle pure form realm, the divine abodes? Why? He put them in the paradoxical situation of not equating nirvana with any kind of formless state, yet allowed them to think of it as something other than the relative world that they perceived as pure suffering. In my opinion, that was because their fixated ego sense was so strong and so rigidly imagined as their real self apart from relational things, that they could only envision release as a glorified projection of their desperate desire to withdraw permanently and escape into this imagined absolute disconnected self. But that's erroneous. Zen often speaks, mocks the arhat on his mountain, imagining that, he's way up there and detached from, safe from everything else. And often says we have to empty emptiness. We have to empty emptiness. Otherwise, we'll think it's some abstracted state. Whereas, of course, emptiness is form. And form is emptiness. And nirvana includes all of that, or it's not nirvana. So this brought them back, he concludes, into contact with the more challenging quest of maintaining the natural bliss of release while remaining infinitely interconnected with everything, which is defined as the fully awakened condition of nirvana. So if this is what, ultimate consciousness, ultimate reality is for a Buddhist, then if this is the absolute, well then I was thinking, We need to apply that to God, the God of the Abrahamic traditions. If that's true, then that's who God is. And actually, you can find some modern theologians and spiritual writers who do push us necessarily in this direction. In Richard Rohr's marvelous book, The Universal Christ, some of you may know, he speaks about the Eucharist. Now, it's easy to see in Jesus, in Christ, that God is suffering, God is connected with relative reality for all eternity, but does that also apply to God's self? So this is what Richard says about, the Eucharist, the bread and wine which become the body of Christ. The bread and wine are stand-ins for the very elements of the whole universe. The whole universe is the body of Christ. Think of Teilhard de Chardin's famous Mass on the World when he offered the whole world on the altar of what is the life of consciousness. The bread being all the positive things going on, the chalice of blood and suffering being all the negative things, and all that's part of reality. That is part of ultimate reality. Why do we resist this, he asks, Richard asks, with this Christification of all matter? He says, the bread and wine are misunderstood as an exclusive presence when in fact their full function is to communicate a truly inclusive and always shocking presence. Because this is shocking. Now get this final sentence. A true believer is eating what he or she is afraid to see and afraid to accept. The universe is the body of God, both in its essence and in its suffering. So not just the body of Christ, that's a little too easy. The universe is the body of God, both in its essence and in its suffering. So even the most, diluted and heavy, and that we just heard from Bob Thurman, that's God's presence. You find something very similar in Elizabeth Johnson's marvelous book, Ask the Beasts. Darwin and the God of Love, where she speaks about God's presence in and all of creation, especially in the suffering. And she quotes the famous German theologian and Cardinal Walter Casper. He says, the suffering and death on the cross, that unexpected, unseemly event, is the unsurpassable self-definition of God. The unsurpassable self-definition of God is that suffering God present to us all. And we often think of, well, how can God allow suffering if God is omnipotent? What does omnipotence mean? Genuine omnipotence. Genuine omnipotence is not kind of some domineering, controlling force. That would be, that would be a sign of weakness. He goes on to say, far from stripping omnipotence away, the self-emptying weakness and suffering are not the expression of a lack, but of the fullness of divine freedom in love. God suffers out of love and by reason of his love, which is the overflow of his being. And that's how omnipotence is truly manifested in love. That's omnipotence, a constant loving presence. Another author is quoted on the next page. If Jesus is indeed the self-expression of God in a human person, then the tragedy of his actual human life can be seen as a drawing back of the curtain to reveal a God suffering in and with the sufferings of created humanity, and so by extension with those of all creation, all sentient beings, if you will, since humanity is an embedded, evolving, and evolved part of it. And on the next page, she asks, one may well ask if the presence of the living God with creatures in their suffering makes any difference. She says, the suffering goes on. But that's how we need to be present, apart from our personal suffering, is presence. That presence is what constitutes our being and our consciousness. We are fully present. What do we do when we're sitting? We're being present. We're learning how to be fully present equals connected, equals identified with. And spreading this radiant light and hope and joy that we experience, that's what our presence is, and that's what the presence of God is. And that's omnipotence, because that's love. Just to keep banging you over the head with this, Ilia Delio, in her latest book, her latest book that just came out, The Not Yet God. There you go. This is process theology. This is God intimately involved with the evolution of the universe. That is the evolution of the universe. You know, she says that God is implicated. She uses quantum physics, saying that there's a divine entanglement. It's a very good word. We should be entangled, inextricably entangled with everything if we want to be fully awake and reach the fullness of, well, fullness of nirvana. Fullness of nirvana and fullness of consciousness is to be entangled and present with and to everything of all times and spaces. She uses she creates a neologism, Ilya does. She speaks of theohology, not just theology, but theohology, which includes everything. So God and everything are intimately interconnected. Of course, what we say about the Buddha, about the absolute being form. And finally, just an evocation of Cynthia Bourgeault's her wonderful book, The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, when she speaks about the final stages. We're speaking about the resurrected body of Christ, you know, which is the whole universe. And Cynthia makes a strong point, if you want to study this, that our soul is not something given in the beginning, like something we have, or, you know, but that it develops, and that's the soul itself develops and is ultimately identical with the resurrected body. There's no difference. So she applies that to God. And the very last sentence, she says, in just such a way, then moving from the microcosm, us, to the macrocosm, God or the absolute, we can say that the economia, or the universe, the kingdom of God, the fully fulfilled universe, is the soul of God. That's God's soul. So not only is the universe the body of God, the universe in its totality is the soul of God. We can sit with that for a while. But it's certainly our body and soul. It's certainly who we are. Call it Christ consciousness, call it the Christ, call it the Buddha, call it God. That's what nirvana is. It absolutely includes, with loving presence, absolutely everything of all times and places. It's no escape. And the only thing that's extinguished is our stupidity and our unawareness and our lack of love. So if you're looking for anything else, too bad. You're not going to get away from the human condition, because God doesn't either, and the Buddha doesn't either. So thank you.